Hello and welcome to my video all about how to make a DIY yarn winder using cardboard. I'm the sort of person that if I can make something rather than buy it, then I will. And I'd been interested in getting a yarn winder for quite a while. They seem to range in price from about £10 to about £100 or more for the really fancy ones. But this version, because it's mostly made of card, only cost me a few pennies. The reason that I wanted a yarn winder is because I like to use centre pull balls of yarn, because that way you can rest the ball of yarn on your table and it won't roll about when you're knitting. I found this project very fun to do, and it probably took me a few hours in total. The resulting yarn winder actually works very well, although it is a bit more labour intensive than a shop bought one. I'm now going to demonstrate how to make this yarn winder. But if you have any questions about what materials you're going to need to make it, or about any measurements, then please see the link that I'm going to put below this video, which will direct you to my written tutorial. Okay, so let's get on with the making. The first thing we're going to do is work with the toilet roll tubes. Then the first step is to cut the top off one of them at a 45-degree angle. To do this, you need to press the end of the tube flat and then measure the width. Then make a mark on one side that's that distance from the top of the tube. Draw a diagonal line between that mark and the top corner of the tube on the other side. Then cut along that line. We then need to strengthen these tubes. So first I measured the diameter of the tubes, which turned out to be 3.8 centimeters. I then cut a couple of strips out of cereal box card that were 3.8 centimeters wide. You basically want strips of cardboard that fit snugly inside the tubes. You then need to cut these strips into 4 pieces, 2 for each tube. For each pair, you need to cut a slot that goes halfway up or halfway down the cardboard strip, as shown. So the strips that are going in the tube that hasn't been cut across the top will look like this. Whilst the strips that are going in the diagonally cut tube should look like this, where one is cut to a 45-degree angle, whilst the other is cut to a height that reaches halfway up the diagonal opening. That way, when the 2 pairs of cardboard pieces are slotted together and put into the tubes, they will look like this. You should then tape these pieces in place to make sure that they don't move about within the tube. The whole purpose of this is to make sure that the tubes do not collapse. Next, you need to add tops and bottoms to the toilet roll tubes using cereal box card. You can make these pieces exactly the same diameter as the tubes if you want. However, I made them slightly bigger so that I could then put more glue around those outside edges, just for added strength. Once those pieces have been attached with glue and left to dry, you can then add a slit in the top of the non-diagonal tube. So what I did was use the utility knife to cut straight across the top of that tube, making the slit about 1 centimeter deep. You should put yours in the center, unlike mine. The next step is to cut the base of the yarn winder out of corrugated cardboard. You need to cut out 3 pieces of the corrugated cardboard, 2 of which will need to be identical and should look like the piece at the bottom of this photo. And the other piece will just be a rectangle, as you can see in the top of this photo. You then need to glue these 3 card pieces together. The side with just the rectangle piece on is the bottom of the base. To glue it, I just used some PVA glue and then I left it to dry. The next step is to put the base on top of a cutting mat and then use your utility knife to cut a circle in one side. This circular hole should be slightly bigger than 1 toilet roll tube so that the tube can rotate freely within it, and it also needs to be at least a couple of centimeters from the sides of the base. I taped around the inside of this hole just to cover up the rough edges and make it smoother. You then need to cut a circle out of the corrugated cardboard. The purpose of this piece will be to hold up and support the ball of yarn. Next, take the toilet roll tube that's been cut at a 45-degree angle and glue the diagonal end onto the centre of this circle and leave to dry. Then take the other toilet roll tube and glue the end that doesn't have a slit in it onto the centre of the other side of the circle. Next, you need to cut a square out of corrugated cardboard that's about the same width as the circle you just made. Then you need to use your utility knife and cutting mat to cut an asterisk type pattern in the centre that's slightly bigger in diameter than the toilet roll tube, and push the toilet roll tube through, making sure that the triangles point upwards along the tube, as you can see here. You then need to superglue these triangles in place, making sure that the square is level. You basically want to glue this square onto the tube as high as you can without it interfering with the circle of card. Don't worry if this looks a bit messy, we can clean it up later. Then leave it to dry. The next step involves adding the wire guide. First, you need to take your awl or other hole making tool and make a hole in the centre of the sticky out section of the base. You then need to make a little spiral in one end of your piece of modelling wire. You then push the straight end of the wire up through the hole in the base, so that the spiral of wire sits underneath the base. Next, you need to take your ruler and measure the distance between the square of corrugated cardboard that you just glued onto your card tube and halfway up the yarn holder tube, which is the tube at the top. You want to take a vertical measurement, and this represents how high above the cardboard base you want the coil of wire to sit. You then measure this distance from the base up the wire, and you then make a coil in the wire in that position. To make the coil, you can either wrap the wire around a pen or similar, or around some round-nosed jewellery pliers. You want to make 2 rotations and then cut off the excess wire. Just make sure that the coil is big enough for your chunkiest yarn to go through. You also need to make sure that the wire guide is facing towards the hole in the base. Once you've made the coil the right height, you then need to glue the spiral of wire in place to the cardboard base. So I applied super glue to the spiral to stick it to the base, and then I cut out a rectangle of corrugated card, the same size as that sticky out section, and then pressed it onto the bottom of that spiral. So now the bottom of the cardboard base should all be level. Then just leave it to dry. As you can see, at this point I added some black duct tape to my cardboard tube. This was partly done to reinforce the strength but also to cover up a messy join and make it look nicer and also smoother. Then it's time for final assembly. So we need to take the tube and push it down through the hole in the base. We then need to cut a circle or a square, it doesn't matter, out of the corrugated cardboard. Again, we make the asterisk pattern with a utility knife so that the tube can be pushed through it. Make sure this time that the triangles are pointing downwards along the tube. Then superglue these triangles in place, making sure that the circle of card is level. Basically, you want to sandwich the base between this circle of card and the square of card you cut out before. This is simply to keep the tube held in place. I left it to dry and then I added some more duct tape to cover the join. To make a kind of handle mechanism, I then cut out another square of cardboard plus a stack of small squares of cardboard, which I glued together, like so. I then glued this onto the bottom of the tube underneath the base. I also covered the handle in duct tape to cover the rough edges. In hindsight, this handle didn't work very well, so I would recommend just adding the larger square and not the stack of small squares. Or of course, you could add your own handle design. Then it was time to do a test run before I did any decorating. If you're happy with how it works and you don't need to fix anything or make any changes, then you can choose to decorate it if you wish. I personally just wanted to hide some of the cardboard to make it look a bit nicer, so I used PVA glue and the decoupage technique to add small pieces of book pages onto the card. So I brushed on some PVA glue, added the pieces of book pages, and then added more glue on top. And I kept repeating that until I was satisfied with the result. I then left it to dry, and I added some more duct tape to cover up any unsightly joins and also to add a border. The only thing you want to be very careful with though is that you don't accidentally glue any moving parts together. So make sure you keep away from anything that needs to rotate. And now that the yarn winder is finished, I'm going to do a full test run. So I weigh one side of the yarn winder onto the table using a heavy book, and I also use a small clamp just to make sure it's secure. I put my ball of yarn that I want to wind into a yarn bowl, then feed the end of the yarn through the wire guide and push it down through the slot at the top of the cardboard tube. I then use the cardboard square underneath the base to rotate the cardboard tubes clockwise. To begin with, I use my hand to keep tension in the yarn as it's fed onto the tube. But once the first few rotations were done, I could just leave the yarn bowl to do this job for me. You just have to keep an eye on it really and make sure that the tension is even. If it starts to go slack, then you'll have to use your hand again to add the tension back into the yarn. Every 25 turns or so, I rotated the ball of yarn a fraction clockwise on the tube so that the yarn didn't keep adding to the same area of the tube. This is an important step if you want to get an even ball of yarn. Once all of the yarn has been wound onto the tube, you take the yarn tail that's left and just weave it into the side of the ball of yarn. You then remove the yarn tail from the slot in the top of the tube and then pull the ball of yarn off the tube completely. And as you can see, I have created a center pull ball of yarn. I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and thank you very much for watching.